Two bridges, one city, and a fight that reached all the way to Washington. For almost 100 years, one private bridge quietly controlled one of the most important trade routes in North America. Then a new bridge came along. Not just bigger, not just newer, publicly backed, politically protected, and designed to end a monopoly that had lasted for generations. And before that new bridge could open, someone tried to stop it. Because this was never just about traffic. It was about power. If you grew up around Detroit, you've probably seen the Ambassador Bridge so many times that you stop thinking about it. It's just there. Steel in the skyline. Trucks rolling nonstop. A border crossing so familiar that it almost feels permanent. But what most people never really think about is this. For decades, that bridge wasn't just a bridge. It was leverage. It was money. It was control over a trade corridor so important that the Windsor-Detroit Gateway became the busiest commercial land border crossing between the United States and Canada. The Ambassador Bridge itself opened on November 15, 1929, and remained privately owned, something incredibly rare for infrastructure this important. And then came the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a publicly backed crossing meant to do what nobody had done before: break the old order at the border. What followed was years of lawsuits, political pressure, land fights, and a battle that said a lot more about who controls Detroit than most people realize. Canada and Michigan structured the new crossing as a publicly owned project, jointly owned by Canada and Michigan, with Canada fronting the full project cost through a public-private partnership at about $5.7 billion Canadian, to be repaid through toll revenue. This isn't really a story about red versus blue. It's a story about old power meeting a new future. To understand why this became such a fight, you have to go back to 1929. That's when the Ambassador Bridge opened between Detroit and Windsor. At the time, it was a feat of engineering. It was massive, symbolic, a statement that Detroit wasn't just a city on a river. It was a gateway. And over time, that gateway became one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure in the region. Because once the auto industry exploded, once supply chains tightened, once just-in-time manufacturing became normal, this crossing became more than a road over water. It became an artery. By the modern era, the Windsor-Detroit Gateway was handling a huge share of cross-border trade. Federal sources have described it as the busiest commercial land border crossing between the US and Canada. And older FHWA material noted the Ambassador Bridge alone carried roughly 27% of US-Canada trade at the time. That kind of position creates something powerful: dependence. And the bridge was not publicly controlled. It was private. Eventually, control of that crossing sat with Manuel Maroon, and later, his son, Matthew Maroon, through the family's bridge interest. That meant one family had extraordinary influence over a choke point in North American commerce. Sources tied to the bridge and public reviews have long emphasized how unusual that was, describing the Detroit crossing as privately owned since construction, and in public commentary as the only privately owned international crossing along the northern US-Canada border. Think about that for a second. A private toll bridge at one of the most critical trade crossings on the continent. That's not normal. And when something like that lasts for decades, it doesn't just make money, it builds an empire. This is the part of the story that makes it bigger than infrastructure. Because control of a bridge like this doesn't just mean toll revenue. It means influence over freight movement. It means influence over development. It means influence over neighborhoods. It means influence over how a city grows around the pressure of trucks, customs, warehousing, and border traffic. Southwest Detroit felt that pressure for years. Not in abstract numbers, but in noise, diesel, land acquisition, and streets built around the needs of trade. And that's where the conversation started to shift, because the question slowly became, should a crossing this important really depend so heavily on one privately owned bridge? That concern shows up again and again in the public record around the Detroit River International Crossing Study and related environmental reviews. Community groups and official responses openly wrestled with fears of a virtual monopoly and the broader conflict between private profit and public regional planning. And once that question got asked seriously, the future of the border was never going to stay settled. For a long time, the Ambassador Bridge felt untouchable. Then the idea of a rival crossing stopped sounding theoretical and started becoming real. The Gordie Howe International Bridge didn't come out of nowhere. For years, officials on both sides of the border had been arguing that the region needed redundancy, more capacity, better highway connections, and less dependence on a single crossing. That's a big part of why the Gordie Howe project was structured the way it was. Not as another private bridge, but as a public one. Official project documents describe it as a jointly owned Canada-Michigan crossing delivered through a public-private partnership. Canada agreed to finance the project up front, with tolls collected on the Canadian side to reimburse those costs over time. That alone tells you how much resistance there was. Canada didn't just support the bridge. Canada basically decided that this thing was too important to leave stalled. And that matters, because the project wasn't cheap. Public Canadian Materials have described the deal as a fixed-price public-private partnership worth about 5.7 billion Canadian dollars. Construction officially began in October of 2018, and the bridge itself wasn't just symbolic. It was practical. It would create the first direct highway-to-highway connection between Highway 401 in Ontario and I-75 in Michigan. Exactly the kind of seamless freight route modern trade depends on. So now the old bridge had a problem. For the first time in generations, real competition wasn't hypothetical. It was being designed, funded, approved, and built. And this is where the story turns. Because the Maroon family did not just quietly accept the arrival of a new bridge. They fought it. In court, in public, through lobbying, through land disputes, through years of pressure meant to slow the project down, complicate it, or stop it entirely. A 2002 Wayne Law Review article summarized the project's history notes. A 2022 Wayne Law Review article summarizing the project's history notes, the Maroon-controlled interest filed multiple challenges, including several unsuccessful lawsuits in Canada against project owners or stakeholders. Other reporting from the mid-2010s described more than a dozen legal cases tied to efforts to block or delay the bridge. That tells you everything. This wasn't a disagreement over architecture. This was a battle over who gets to control the border for the next 100 years. And from the Maroons' family perspective, the threat was obvious. If the Gordie Howe Bridge opens and succeeds, the Ambassador Bridge stops being the only game in town. That changes leverage. That changes pricing power. That changes influence. And that changes the future. So the fight kept going. Not because the old bridge was useless, but because it was profitable. And monopolies, especially old ones, rarely give up ground without making it painful. But the most important part of this story isn't just that the fight happened. It's how far that fight seemed to reach. Now this is where you have to be careful, because this story can get oversimplified fast. The point here is not to turn this into partisan theater. The point is to notice what happens when private economic power gets close to political power. That overlap has hovered around the bridge story for years. And in 2026, it came back into the spotlight in a very public way. In February 2026, President Donald Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge and said the permit for the project could be amended. The Associated Press reported that the White House objected to the ownership structure, even as the bridge was nearing operation. Then another layer emerged. Federal Election Commission records, reported by CBS Detroit and others, showed that Ambassador Bridge owner Matthew Maroon donated $1 million to MAGA Inc., a Trump-aligned super PAC, less than a month before Trump threatened to stop the rival bridge from opening. Now, to be precise, that does not prove a quid pro quo. And that distinction matters, but it absolutely raised questions. Because from the outside, the timing looked hard to ignore. A bridge owner with a direct financial interest in stopping a competitor. Political money. A federal threat aimed at that competitor. And a project that had already been negotiated, financed, and pushed towards opening. That's the kind of thing that makes people stop and ask, wait, what is really going on here? And even if you strip away the headlines, the deeper point still stands. This border crossing was never just concrete and cables. It was power sitting in physical form. And maybe that's the most Detroit part of this whole story. Because while executives, governments, and political players argued over the future, the city itself kept carrying the weight of the decision. Southwest Detroit lived with the truck routes, the land fights, the pollution concerns, the uncertainty about what kind of border infrastructure would define the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the broader region had everything riding on the flow of trade. Jobs, auto plants, suppliers, warehouses, ports, tourism, tax base, regional growth. When people say it's just a bridge, that misses the point. Bridges decide where traffic goes, where money goes, where development goes, which neighborhoods get burdened, which ones get connected, which systems stay private, which ones become public. That's why this story matters. Because in Detroit, infrastructure is never just infrastructure. Its destiny was stealing it. And despite all the pressure, the Gordie Howe Bridge kept moving forward. Construction began in 2018. The deck connection was completed in July 2024. And by early 2026, official project updates said major construction was complete and the bridge had shifted into testing and commissioning ahead of opening in 2026. The project has also already launched toll account registration and business prep for users. That's important because it means the project crossed a line where it stopped being an argument and became a fact. A real bridge, a real rival, a real transfer of power. And once that happens, the border changes forever. The Ambassador Bridge still stands. It still matters. It will still carry traffic. But it no longer stands alone. And that might be the real ending to this whole story. Not destruction. Not collapse. Just the end of exclusivity. For nearly a century, one bridge symbolized control. Then a second bridge showed up and forced the region to ask a hard question. Should something this important ever belong, in effect, to one private interest alone? That's why this story sticks with me. Because on the surface, it looks like a fight over infrastructure. But underneath, it's really about who gets to shape the future of a city. Old power, new power, private leverage, public ambition, all meeting at the river. And if you're from Detroit, or Windsor, or anywhere in this region, you know that border stories are never just border stories. They're stories about identity, about money, about who gets remembered, and who gets to decide what comes next. So I'm curious what you think. Was the Gordie Howe Bridge always inevitable? Or do you think the Ambassador Bridge empire would have lasted another generation if nobody pushed back? Let me know in the comments, because this is one of those Detroit stories that feels obvious once you hear it, and impossible to unsee after that.